Posted by u/steamy_putato. Serious, Redditors who killed someone, what happened? A guy attacked me at 3 a.m. while I was walking to work. Literally barreled out of the woods and tackled me onto concrete with his belt undone. He broke 3 of my ribs. I tried to choke him long enough to render him unconscious. And I did. He never woke up. It still bothers me. I was arrested and questioned in the hospital. Uncuffed the following morning after the police obtained security camera footage. I've been asked before how I managed to hold the choke long enough to kill him. I don't know. I may have crushed his windpipe. I have no concept of how long the choke, or even the whole situation, lasted. My husband and I only had one car at the time, and I had to ride with him to work one morning around 4 a.m. so I could drive back home. It was raining and the road wasn't lit. We were just chatting with one another and I was reaching for the CD album for some tunes. I looked up for a moment and thought I saw what looked like a crumpled up blanket or trash bag or something in the road, but I couldn't make it out at all. My husband was driving and couldn't see it at all. Neither of us got to see for sure what it was until the headlights got close enough, and by then it was too late to react. It was a man, curled up in a ball in the middle of the road, dressed completely in black clothing. I remember crying out just a half second before we struck him and went over him. It hasn't even dawned on my husband what had just happened, and I was screaming and crying in horror. My husband was also very distraught and was shaking. I told him he has to call 911 and get help, so he did. He got out of the car and went over to check on the man and see if he was responsive at all. Nothing. The ambulance and cops came. They asked us a bunch of questions and the whole routine. The news crews came out to film everything. That man died on the way to the hospital. This haunted me for over a year after it happened. A month or so later we found out that the man had abandoned his truck at a nearby gas station and walked away. He wasn't from the area either. We learned that 2 of his friends came down here to talk to him and tried to get him to go back home with them and get back into rehab, but he had refused and said he wasn't coming back. There was a lot of alcohol and meth in his system. I don't know what that does to a person when those things are mixed, but somehow this guy found his way into the middle of a poorly lit city street and curled himself up. I'll never know why he was there. I'm still afraid of driving on rainy nights. I don't think I slept well at all for a while afterwards. I have to travel that same road to work, and now I always think about it when I pass that spot on the road. I was working as a cleaner at an aged care. Resident with severe dementia was sleeping. I decided to mop the floor in her room while she was asleep. Resident woke up and decided to get out of bed without assistance. Resident slipped on wet floor. Carers found her unconscious and called ambulance. Resident died at the scene. Nothing came of it as Resident had no living relatives. I got told it was the carer's fault for not keeping a close eye on Resident, but I blame myself. I still think about this late at night. Edit. Thank you all for the supportive messages. It has helped me realize the occurrence of falls with the elderly. Indirectly, forgive any format issues. I'm on mobile. 11 years ago, my best friend and I started using crack. The addiction hit us hard. For 10 months straight we were basically driving our families bankrupt with very hard and constant usage. One night, Mike was unable to sleep. He tells me he hadn't been able to sleep for a week at that point. I told him I'd cut him off for a few days, as I was the one still managing to find money to get any. But then the night before he died, I went back onward and gave him some. He used very little. I used my stash and ran out. The next day I had to leave to pick up some furniture for my grandma. He said he was feeling sick, so he stayed behind. On the way to where I needed to go, I stopped and got more crack. Picked up the furniture and went home. Whole trip took about 42 minutes. I was counting the time cause I had a short window to be out in the first place for reasons that are not important. I come home and call out to Mike. He didn't answer, so I assumed he was upstairs. My room was on the first floor while the rest of the house was on the second, and so decided to drop off Grandma's furniture before going back to my room. I enter my room and I don't see him immediately. Then I spot his legs sticking out behind the bed. He was out cold between the wall and bed, dying from an overdose. I pulled him out from there and then shouted at Mother to call 911. Cops came first. Ambulance about 45 minutes later. They picked him up, loaded him into the ambulance and took him to the hospital. His mother came rushing to my house right before they took him. I got in my car and drove behind them. I told the doctors and everyone what was going on. Didn't care about my legal safety, just told him it's probably the crack. About an hour later I went home. 2 hours later his mother calls me to tell me he had slipped straight into a coma. 1 hour later, she calls again to tell me he had died. I tried to kill myself that night by smoking everything I acquired while I was out, all in a single sitting. I, clearly, survived. I've been clean since. I miss him dearly and will never forgive myself for what happened. A childhood friend suffered liver failure, and was on a breathing machine. When she breathed her last, her father could not bring himself to turn on the breathing apparatus. So, I did. And then the men from the funeral home came. They were very polite, and we gave them all the info they needed for them to do their job. Her stepmother stayed at the house, while I took her dad out for ice cream, just to be away from the scene. It was a warm summer night, and we walked and talked and had ice cream at the local Sweet Frog. You may think that might not qualify, but there is a moment of finality when you switch off a friend's oxygen machine. About 6 months after, I was visiting a friend, recounting the story, and suddenly the dam burst and I cried for hours. I guess this technically counts. I was an EMT out in the field my first week after license qualification. During those initial weeks, you have to ride as a third with a training officer until they sign off that you're competent. We get a call to a hospice facility, patient unconscious and unresponsive. Note that this isn't just a regular nursing home, this is the final stop for people who don't have long left and are being made as comfortable as possible. We're advised that paramedics are also responding, which is standard for any calls involving altered consciousness. As we're on the way, Mida tells me that this particular facility is a regular customer for this particular call. If a patient dies at the facility, they have to jump through a bunch of regulatory hoops and the paperwork is annoying, so they call 911 before the patient dies, dumping the problem on the hospital. We get there first, talk to the staff, get led into the patient room. The nurse tells us that the patient has been on his way out for a while, that this was expected. He, heartbreakingly, has no friends or family and has a DNR, a do not resuscitate order. They admit they don't expect him to wake up. Mida gets on the radio and cancels the medics, telling them we're transporting to the ER. First mistake, a DNR means do not resuscitate, which means if your heart stops or you stop breathing, do not try to restart them. It does not mean do not treat. The patient was owed a full and comprehensive attempt to restore consciousness. Think of it this way, if a DNR patient gets stabbed, we wouldn't have just sat there and watched him bleed out. We load the patient onto the bus and head to the ER. Code 1, no lights or sirens. I'm sat in the back with the patient, eyes glued to his chest watching his breathing. I had an uneasy feeling about the whole situation. We'd been told he was already circling the drain, and something felt wrong. We pull up to the ambulance bay, I open the doors and release the cot from the clamps, pulling the patient out. Here's the second mistake, the cots we had trained on were the type that loaded onto the bus by swinging the support frame 90 degrees along the length of the cot. When you loaded, you put the front wheels, by the head, onto the ambulance floor, pull a release lever and just push, the main frame pivots up and locks into place. This one was older, you have to put the front wheels on, pull the release then have your partner manually lift the collapsing frame up like a scissor lift. So as I pulled the cot halfway out, I hit the frame release, expecting the pivot to smoothly come down as the cot clears the rear bumper. Instead, the frame waits until the whole thing has cleared the floor, so only the loading wheels by the head have contact, and it plummets. Wham! I hadn't dropped the patient, but the whole cot shook violently as the wheels slammed into place. The two is laughing at the rookie mistake, I'm horribly embarrassed. They close the doors, we wheel into the ER and the non-to goes to find the triage nurse to get a bay assignment. It's at that point I look more closely at the patient, who isn't breathing anymore. That means we don't wait for the nurse, we just let ourselves in. Which we do, finally moving in a hurry. Everyone scrambles, ER doc descends on the bay, we wave the DNR paperwork at him and report. He looks at the paperwork, looks at the patient, looks at us and asks why did you cancel the medics? It was 99% likely I'd stopped the patient's heart with the rookie jolt of the cot, causing the DNR to take effect. If I'd unloaded the right way, he would have still been breathing by the time the ER took over, and they would have likely revived him. As a rookie on my first week I just had a nasty note added to my file, but Mida wasn't ATA for a good long while after that, and we all got a very in-depth refresher course on what exactly a DNR does not cover. Friend of mine was outside of a bar waiting for a ride home. It wasn't that late at night and he texted me. I drove about 10 minutes to go get him. When I arrived, there were 3 other guys surrounding him, obviously wanting trouble. I ran and tackled one of the guys to the floor. I was completely focused on this guy because he was literally face to face with my friend. We start hitting each other and a bystander helped with the other 2 men. I managed to stumble back on my feet and kick the guy in the face. He hit his head against the wall of the building and I knew it wasn't a good sound. With my adrenaline rushing, I looked over and the other two men were running away. I was the one to call the cops and report everything. I didn't kill someone but my aunt and her husband did. They were camping and asleep in their tent. In the middle of the night, some strange man slipped into the tent and got on top of her. She woke up and started screaming, so her husband grabbed his gun and shot the guy. They both immediately ran out and went to tell the man running the campground what had happened. By the time police got there and checked the tent, he was dead. Apparently the guy they killed had been arrested, exactly a year prior, for breaking into a tent full of kids at some other campground. Loading some beams on a trailer at work, the truck driver walked between the live load and the trailer. One of the beams slid off, crushing and killing him. I wasn't new to the job, neither was he. I couldn't stop the equipment in the split second before he walked between them. He knew better but chose not to wait a few more seconds for it to come down to the ground. I tried to get it off of him but it was more harm than good from that angle. The hardest part of the situation is that it was determined an industrial accident, so no charges or anything got filed, but the family sued for the insurance payout. It was really hard to watch the video several times of the incident, even though I would never forget what happened anyways. I never felt like I did anything wrong. The video shows that as well. I don't blame them for suing for the insurance. I wish they would have actually shown up to the hearings instead of just their attorney. I would like to offer my condolences, if they would accept. In the industry, we have looked at many different ways of doing this same job to avoid situations like this. We have come to the conclusion that given all of the circumstances, this is the safest way to do the job. There are other ways to load and unload the beams, but they have a higher risk of injury or death.